Hello, everybody, and today in Incite Club, we're talking about radical self responsibility. Stay tuned.
The first rule of Incite Club is you don't talk about Incite Club. You do Incite Club. The second rule of Incite Club is the only assumptions we make about one another are that we all want happiness and we all want to avoid suffering. The third rule of Incite Club is you check all your other assumptions at the door. We hope these conversations will bring you insights that incite you to action. Welcome to Incite Club.
Welcome back. So, where is your mind, Megan?
Well, we always talk about how something in the introduction strikes us, and this time what caught my attention was we hope these conversations incite you to action. And I'm just reflecting, have I been taking action? I don't know. I've been having a lot of things happen to me, which maybe ties in perfectly with this idea of radical self-responsibility and cause and effect. And so, that's kind of a nice thing for me to remember. There's always external, like whatever's going on for me internally is always playing out externally. And if I'm in a place where I feel like a lot is happening to me, then that's a good reminder that I want to step more into being in action and at cause rather than that effect.
I would, well, just before we started here, me and Megan, we were talking about the things that we were reading, and she was reading Eckhart Tolle and something about the pain body. I was reading again, I hope I don't mess this name up, the Kabbalion, and I was in the really digging into the cause and effect law, which is about this thing of being responsible for the cause and not just suffering the effect. And I've been reflecting a lot on this as well, because I feel like I had moments where I've been in the co-creator mode, really being the cause of things, making things happen. And sometimes my energy falls, and then I fall into the effect, into being a victim of circumstances in some way. And right now, I feel like I'm just jumping back into like in the action, like you're saying, of jumping back into creative mode. Yet I do feel like, because you mentioned action, before we get into action, we need to sit in that position of uh, mind, of or not mind in the sense of the thoughts and so on, but coming back into our creation in the mental, in the visualization, in our internal world, so that we can project that out instead of just dealing with whatever is swirling around.
Yeah. I'm curious if something pops to mind for you, so we could kind of get a concrete example of what it looks like to be co-creating. Like what are some signs where you're co-creating versus being a victim of circumstance?
Haven't thought about that. Synchronicity is a big sign.
Yeah.
And you think of something and that happens. That's a big thing as well. And like, yeah, synchronicity can come in many ways. It can be the repeated numbers, it can be common themes, or you're thinking of something and someone with you talks about that, or you see somewhere. But yeah, big synchronicities, like you're thinking of something and that pops in there, or you want to, let's say, you want to, I'm giving a simple example, you want to buy something and then it is presented to you or something like that. uh, these are some signs that I feel like, oh yeah, this is all in the right place.
Yeah.
uh, Yeah.
I feel that too, and there's like an ease of movement. It's like the space between thinking, "Oh, that would be wonderful," and then it coming into life is just so contracted, or it's like almost instant. Yeah, I relate to that. And then like being I guess I come into awareness of being a victim of circumstance when I find myself complaining a lot. That's a sure sign. That's, when I've already like
Yeah.
allowed the energy to kind of build up for a bit. But feeling that things are hard, feeling I have to do a lot of planning, feeling that it takes so much work and so much energy to bring anything to fruition. I'm seeking a lot. Any others come up for you for being a victim of circumstance?
Yeah, when it's working, it's flow, right? It feels like everything is going, and when we're, I think it. Well, I want to say friction, which is basically what you're saying as well. But also when we feel like everything is against us,
Yeah. Yeah.
because when we are, if you think of the word even co-creator, right? We're creating with. So if we're with, we're one. And if we're one, there's no other to be against. Everything is going together.
Yeah.
So whenever we're feeling there's something against, and sometimes other things in life make we feel like there's that against, and of course there's polarity as well. Polarity is one of the rules in the Kybalion as well. So, of course, there's polarity, but we need to remember this is a big one that I keep trying to remember. And sometimes, for some things, are hard. It's hard to apply, for me at least, in my humanness. But polar, uh, polarity is just extremes from the same energy. So it talks, for example, like heat. Where do you know that it's no longer cold and it's warm, or it's warm and cold? It's just as a spectrum,
Yeah. It's a
the same
continuum.
thing, a continuum. So, and that can be reconciled. And our ability to reconcile things is our ability to create. We live in a polarity world where everything is mental, so we need to use our mind to be able to reconcile into one and then be able to create with it.
Yeah.
That's me trying to put everything together in my mind.
I love it. Well, that sparks two things for me. But the first one I want to say is about I think co-creation is awesome because there is still a little bit of difference. And what I mean by that is I'm not doing it all. So I've had these like orgasmic experiences a few times in my life writing with somebody else where
Mm.
you're bouncing ideas and then it builds, right? And the whole becomes greater than the sum of the parts. And the other person brings something that I didn't think of and I go, "Oh yeah, and then with that we could take it and do this." So with co-creation, yes, I'm creating and I'm in it and I'm an agent, but there's also I feel a delight in it where I'm like, "Oh, and I didn't do that part, but that part still happened." Like, "Oh God, I like your contribution. Thank you."
Yes.
uh,
Ah,
which is interesting, right? Because it's like there's still enough differentiation where something happens and I appreciate it because I know I didn't create it, but then I can add on to it and without friction. So maybe it's less about like there being no differentiation, or this is my experience anyway. It's less about there not being differentiation and more about my accepting and allowing and being like, "Oh yes,
yeah.
friend." Right.
Yeah. It's not that there's no friction, maybe, but there's no like, it's not a barrier. It
Yeah.
flows with.
I'm not using my energy and will to push back against. I'm
Yeah.
using my energy and will like a relay race, right? And one person hands the baton to the next and then you keep going. You're like,
Yeah.
"Oh, awesome. Thank you for covering that distance and now I'm going to cover this distance." Um
Yes.
that's one thing that sparks, but the other thing you're saying about polarity, this is exactly why I was like, "Oh gosh, Eckhart Tolle is so wise and why don't I listen to him more often?" I was listening to The Power of Now And it was very much just synchronistically led. I put on Audible and I was like, what am I listening to? Oh, and it caught my attention, because I've listened to
Mm.
it before. And then I was like, just wherever it already is in the middle, that's where I'm listening. And the conversation started with this idea of polarity and how we think that um, misery is the opposite of joy, for example. And he's like, not really, not really. There are these polarities, and there's like happiness and pleasure. That's the opposite of misery. But those are emotions. And like joy is a state of being.
Mhm.
Peace is a state of being. Love is a state of being. And I was like, that makes so much sense. And for me, that's helpful with trying to wrangle this idea of the polarities and that everything has an opposite. And so if I think, well, how can love and joy and the sense of presence and the sense of being one with everything, how can that be on the same spectrum with hate? And he's like, it's not. The emotions play this tug of war, but then the states of being are more foundational and fundamental.
Mm.
And I found that really helpful. And he's talking about just even the word emotion, which means like a disturbance. It comes from the Latin, like something is moving and disturbing. And they're fabulous, right? Because they move us and disturb us and let us know, hey, you've got a thought form that's leading you in a certain direction. You better pay attention. Like this thought form could easily take over if you're not aware of it. So it's not condemning emotions, but it's also just pointing out that underlying or underneath the emotions is the stillness of knowing I'm one. And that resonates so much with my experience. I was like, oh, thank you, Eckhart. That's the way for me to frame the polarity of the emotions, and that each emotion has an opposite, but that there isn't really an opposite of the love and connectedness I feel. There's an emotion that takes me out of it and makes me feel I'm disconnected. And also it just makes so much sense to me that all of the thought forms, the emotional impulses, the physical distress, the social distress, the emotional distress that we feel comes ultimately from feeling disconnected, from
Yes.
being knocked out of that remembrance and presence that like, oh, I am God, God is me, I am you, you are me, everything is one. This
Yeah.
this mouse I accidentally murdered. There's been a lot of animal death in our house lately. I was trying to save it. I was trying to free
Uh,
it from a glue trap, and it just got overwhelmed and overloaded, like because you have to use warm water to
mm.
dissolve the glue. And I just watched him go like, I can't take it anymore. And he gave up and his life force left him. And it was horrifying. It was absolutely horrifying. And in that moment, I'm like, okay, I am this mouse. Like this mouse is me. I'm facing death. How could like I'm being invited to face the misery and like the ultimate suffering of life. This poor little creature is like, oh my God, I'm in terror. This cat chased me into a house. This human is like torturing me. Life is terrible.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. The suffering is
Yeah.
part of life. Yeah.
Yeah. It's a real suck part of life. And it's interesting because I noticed that I like sometimes relate to there we get a lot of murdered animals in our house with two cats. Um, and sometimes I relate to them kind of asking them to what's the word I'm looking for? Not redeem. Oh my goodness, I've lost it. But like absolve me. Sometimes I find myself relating to the animals like, "Oh, can you please make it okay that you're dead and it's my fault?" Like by proxy, right? Because I have these cats and I let them outside.
Yeah.
And I'm like, wow, that sucks. So already this animal faced ultimate suffering and died. And now you're like asking it for something, right? You're like, please make it okay. Take away my guilt, right? Like sometimes I'm relating to it, like, take away my guilt. And a more honest way to relate to it is like, oh, that happened and it's my fault and it really sucks. And this is going to happen to me too.
Yeah.
Maybe
And,
not in the same way,
and
but
at the same time, if you think of it, your kids are thinking, I'm helping with the economy of the house. I brought food.
they think, why aren't you hunting? They keep trying to teach us to hunt and they think we're really rubbish at it.
Yeah.
Like, I'll train you. I'll look, I brought a live mouse so you can hunt it and you can chase it. Yeah. They've got their own
Yeah.
thinking around it. But it just, maybe that brings us back to this kind of self-responsibility. Like, it's hard to interact with suffering. And I think that's kind of a go-to response that we have for with other people suffering is, can you make me feel better about this?
Mm.
Do you know what I mean?
Yes. And that the shame and guilt are difficult emotions. Are those that make us feel like uh, there's something fundamentally wrong with us. We're dirty for some reason, and then we need to remove it somehow. And probably that's why, or that's part of why, so many traditions in the past would use like scapegoats and like, now we're killing this animal, so it's this is all the guilt and shame and so on is cleared.
Yep,
uh,
Lamb
as
of God.
Yeah, as if like if you give away one life, then everything else it's done. Well, anyway,
But we do,
but
we project it all into one place, and I think
yeah,
there's a helpful grain in that, right? Which is like, we need to somehow excise this from ourselves and remove this from ourselves. And the challenge is when we do it by projection. I mean, I can't speak to people thousands of years ago and what attitude they were using to sacrifice the ram, but I know in our modern day society, the way we create scapegoats is we're still experiencing all the self-hatred. We're
yeah,
just we're just externalizing the violence or
yeah.
the you
We
know
project we project into someone that this person is terrible and they're blamed for our problems, and then done. It's not my fault anymore. I'm the victim, right?
Yeah.
As if being the victim was a good thing. And we're talking about self responsibility because, yeah, we might be able to get somehow cleared of shame or guilt if we project all the shame and guilt and all the responsibilities in someone else and blame someone else, but we lose the connection to be a co-creator, to
Yeah.
be the cause. We become just like being carried by the wave of whatever happens, and then everything that happens to us is just like, this is how life is, and
Yeah.
it's terrible, and just pass through it as if it was a dream and then it ended.
And I don't think we really can get rid of the guilt of knowing we put it on someone else either. I mean, it might be really buried, especially if we're not
Yeah.
practicing self-awareness. But I mean, as I was listening to The Power of Now, I was like, oh, yeah, this just explains kind of the human condition, right? We
Mm.
start disconnected. We like double down on the feeling of pain because that's what becomes comfortable. And then before we know it, like our whole life is just um making other people miserable from our pain, and then like attracting more pain because that's what feels comfortable. I was
Resonates.
Say again.
That's what resonates with.
Yeah. And it becomes the space. And I really appreciated that. like view, because then I could, I could think of an extreme. We sometimes we hear about people and we're like, that person is just kind of pure evil, right? It's like there's, oh my gosh, that person is like, there's no way they could kind of come back and be a human in society anymore, right? Like Hannibal Lecter, right? It's like, it's just the humanness is gone. We sometimes encounter this in literature, in real life, in the news, right? We have this thought about a person. And I find it so helpful to go like, it is just a spectrum. And it's not like that's a human made out of different stuff, or that's a human with like a bad soul, but that's a human whose pain body has grown, and like there's more cancerous pain body than human at this point. But it's because it grew and grew and grew. It's not because there was something like fundamentally wrong with that human being at birth. And so like our most important job becomes to become aware of when we are identifying with the pain and identifying with the suffering, and saying, this is who I am. And I think like the victim energy is so seductive, because it's this combination of pain, identifying with the pain, and but people should feel sorry for me. And really, what does that feed? It feeds that absolutely reasonable and like evolutionarily uh, makes sense desire to know we're safe and taken care of, but it's distorted.
And at the same time, that like I agree with the safe and taken care of, but at the same time, I feel like it's a form of control as well. Because
Yeah.
if you feel hopeless that you're the victim and you're just suffering from all this, but others need to be sorry for you, then you're controlling the energetic field of the
One
situation.
100%. My favorite image of this is the character of the mom from the show Arrested Development. I don't know if you've ever seen it, but she's manipulative, just mean, not responsible for her own actions in any way. And whenever she gets uncomfortable facing the consequences of her actions, she'll just go, "Oh, I'm a terrible mother." And then all the kids go, "Oh, no, you're not, mom. Oh, no, you're not." Right. And it becomes like she's the one who, I mean, they're all just pretty rotten human beings, is the concept of the show. But it's her actions that have created bad outcomes, and then she turns it to, oh, I'm just so terrible, and everybody automatically socially responds with needing to comfort her. And I find that image just so perfect for this, you
Yeah.
know
A-
exploration.
And the interesting thing is that if anyone would say like, "Yeah, you're right. You are a terrible mom,"
Mhm.
wouldn't be acceptable.
It wouldn't, and at the same time, it would break the pattern.
Yeah.
But then we're suckered into that guilt of, trying to make somebody feel better because they're in victim mode, and then it breeds the resentment and all
Yeah.
of those things. But yeah, I mean, so this decision of whether we get to be co-creators or we just spend our whole lives being at effect, I feel like is the I don't know, it's like the challenge of the age, or maybe that's just, it's my big lesson in this decade of my life. So maybe I'm just feeling like it's what everybody's learning. It's definitely what I'm learning.
It might be something that it's for all of us to learn. And I was even thinking when you were talking about people who are just feeling like terrible human beings and so on, thinking both of polarity and all these, how the things that we don't integrate within ourselves end up being projected out elsewhere. Um, Most humans disconnect from anything that they don't want to feel or they don't want to. And even like I consider myself pretty self-aware of my shadows and everything, uh and I accept a lot of this stuff, but even I have times that I can see myself like, okay, I don't want to deal with this right now.
Yeah.
And I'm pushing it aside for whenever I really have the capacity to deal with things. Um, and knowing that most people probably don't even do the self-assessment to be aware of things or the clearing or whatever, and they're just pushing things aside and projecting onto others, blaming others, not taking the responsibility for the things that the ways that we act that end up creating reactions and
Yeah.
so on. um, of course there will be extremes that are going to like portray all the things that the mass of human beings are pushing down.
Yeah, it's like the landfill. It's like all the garbage is just getting pushed over here and pushed over here and pushed over. You're like,
Yeah.
oh, it's a big stinky mess. And what I find really fascinating too, I don't know if you've read any Dr. Daniel Amen. He does these I forget what they're called, like measuring the electricity that's going to different parts of the brain. He does a lot of work with people with ADD and ADHD and like looking at in different types of ADHD where electricity, like certain parts of the brain are getting way more electricity than is helpful, and other parts are not getting enough. And he talks about conflict as a type of self medication for people with both ADHD and traumatic brain injury, um, because it makes the executive function part of the brain fire up, so it gives you more focus. And we've talked about anger as a way, like a way of gaining power energetically, right? Like definitely it's higher up on the energetic scale than being in depression and apathy. But if you get angry, it can actually give you a jolt of energy. And when I read that, I was like, oh my God, my whole life makes sense. Grady and I used to get in these like really terrible arguments whenever we would go on long drives. And I started noticing that and started noticing it. And then I put the pieces together and it was like, I would get tired. And even if I wasn't the one driving, it would make me nervous to be tired in the car because even as the passenger, I'm like, oh, what if the driver gets tired? Like, it's like my responsibility for driving home and it's late at night to kind of be alert and awake. And so I'm like subconsciously knowing that I need energy and that one of the ways I can get energy is to start conflict.
It makes so much sense.
And then all of a sudden, I'm adrenalized and I'm awake. We even like once we figured this out, Grady and I joked about starting a business that would be like a hotline you could call, and it would be marketed like falling asleep in the car, call this number and we'll keep you awake. But what it would really be is the person would find ways to argue with you and pick fights. Like they would kind of figure out what your political beliefs were and then say the opposite. So you'd be on the phone and be like, I can't believe you thought that one was a good president. That guy was terrible. And you would never fall asleep. Um,
Ah.
but we are looking for things that help us, but just in this kind of misguided way.
Mm.
And
Yeah.
again, just like self-medication with substances, right? So people who have gone through massive trauma and end up with like an alcohol addiction, they're doing something that does feel helpful in the moment, or all of us, with our
Mhm.
like scrolling addictions, that numbing does feel helpful in the moment. And so like this, it kind of opens up for this conversation of how can we take manageable steps towards self-responsibility that don't result in just complete overwhelm. I'm reading a really interesting book right now called I Feel Love, and the subtitle is something like MDMA and feeling connected in a fractured world or something like this. And there are a lot of case studies of people with severe trauma who get MDMA assisted therapy, some of whom have an amazing experience and some of whom don't. And there was one woman who said, I felt like I went in and got open heart surgery and they, fixed whatever was wrong with my valve, but then they didn't sew me back up because she
Mm.
felt like the integration after the session wasn't sufficient. And I was like, "Oh man, like that's terrible, right? Here's something that's supposed to be helping um to put somebody in a state where they're out of their default mind, they're open to being able to see themselves in a different way, have more compassion, like up their empathy. The way MDMA works is that like you get a massive release of oxytocin because it um I forget which way it works. It either blocks serotonin from being collected, something like it does something to your serotonin, which like you floods you with oxytocin, the connection hormone. And like so in that state, it is possible to have massive breakthroughs and to be able to see things from a different perspective and go like, oh, I can forgive myself and I see where I was coming from and I can forgive that other person. I see where they were coming from. But I found that fascinating that it doesn't automatic it's not like a magic pill where automatically there's the capacity for um, healing or for self responsibility. You still have to go on that journey to figure out how does this integrate with all the beliefs that I've had in my life about myself and other people up to this point.
Mm, yeah, that's interesting. Mm.
So, what are the small steps towards self responsibility? What are the manageable steps?
Yeah, well, you mentioned with that forgiveness and acceptance, and I believe those are probably two big ones. But one thing that I oh my god, I wish I could remember his name now, and I forgot. But there's this, you might know who I'm talking about. There's this guy who was, I can't remember if he was from the military or the marine, but anyway, U.S. Army, that talks about radical responsibility quite a lot. I can find his name and put into the show notes later. But the way he explained this, like talking about how he had to be the most responsible person in the war, for example, which was his case, was like, if something goes wrong there and somebody dies, it's, or they lose someone and lose a battle, or so it doesn't matter if it was the soldiers' fault or if it was the logistics fault or the fault. It happened anyway. So he was the one that needed to be responsible about everyone, and that needed to be taking care of everything to make sure that everything went right. Like, doesn't uh it was still his fault. He would take like this, and I know that fault is a word that we feel like, oh yeah, I don't want to be guilty, or I want to be, but he knew that for things to go right, he needed to take the responsibility over everything. If the soldier does something wrong, he didn't train the guy
Yeah.
well. Was he equipped with everything that he needed? Uh, am I doing everything? It's not just about, but I did everything that I could. Is really, have I actually covered all the bases? Right? So I think we got a little bit, and this is not to be like, I know that there's flow, and then we think like, oh, this is over controlling, maybe, but I don't think it's about over controlling. I feel it's more like um, about not getting lazy into like, oh yeah, I've done enough, but really focusing on, I'm gonna give me my 100% for the things that I really care about. Thank God we're not on war on most of the things that we are doing, but I'm gonna give my 100% in it, regardless of other circumstances. Eh,
Mm.
And this is where I feel like I can fall victim of circumstances sometimes, where I feel like, oh, but that person is not doing enough, so I'm doing enough. And is it about the other person, or is it about what I want to create? can I give 100% and accept whatever is the 100% of the other?
Hmm. Yeah. That resonates deeply. I had a situation recently where I was feeling like, okay, this didn't turn out well, but it's not my fault. It's not my fault. And a wiser part of me um, thought to ask the other person, um, is there something I could do differently to prevent this
Yeah.
happening next time? And I was
Oh,
like, that feels like self-responsibility, right? Because I was
yeah.
resisting it. I was like, it's not my fault. This was out of my control. And it was like, okay, do you think we could change the process and specifically my part of the process so we get a better outcome next time? And that I was like, I'm giving myself a gold star for that.
I love that, because that was also you creating the openness for for things to happen, and like you're taking responsibility for your part of things. It's not like, oh, but they did that, so that justifies what I've done. And not exactly what part of the thing that I'm responsible, because in any conflict, in any situation, we have a part in it
Yeah.
as well.
And the powerful part of this was it was like, this is a work thing and it's me and somebody else working together to
Yeah.
hopefully create a great outcome for a third person over here. The third person over here got kind of a weird outcome. So now we're like, okay, where was the disconnect? And so it also strengthens that feeling of we're working together. And
Yeah.
it, just reiterates the message like I'm committed to helping. Like I'm committed to this person getting a good outcome. So like what do you think we can do and what's something that would and opens the gate because sometimes it's hard to tell people, oh, I wish you would have done this differently. But
Yeah.
by asking, then it loses that charged feeling, right? Then
Yeah.
the other person is able to be like, oh, actually, now that you mention it, what if we do this differently without it being like you did something wrong and I'm going to control you to change it.
Now that you mentioned this, there were moments where, even though I felt hurt in some ways by someone, and there were more than one time that happened. I can give myself a pat in the back for that as well, where I felt like, oh, okay, this is where I can ask for forgiveness on my part, and I reach out first and
Yeah.
explain why what I done wasn't okay. And I feel like a lot of people don't take their responsibility in this way, because then they feel they're gonna be uh, beat on their heads. They're going to be made to feel guilty, and like all this stuff that we were talking about, that we don't want to feel guilt, shame, and
Yeah.
all these things. So one of the things that I feel like is radical responsibility is to ask for forgiveness as well, and to say I'm sorry, even when you might feel like, but I'm not responsible about everything. But are you responsible about 1% of what's happening? Because if yes, yeah, you can start the conversation
Yeah.
and solve things, instead of separating and like not talking.
And don't you find that it immediately helps the other person want to like reconnect? Or maybe not in all cases, but
Yeah.
if there's a strong underlying relationship,
Yeah.
right? That act of, oh, I'm really sorry for my part in that. It has a softening. And
Yeah.
then instead of like the arms race of building up evidence against one another, we're in peace negotiations. I always remember learning to drive and getting the little insurance card that you carry with you, the proof of insurance card, and how it has this, like it says really big, if you're in an accident, don't apologize, because it can be legally binding. Like if hit, if something happens, right? You get a little scrape in the car with somebody. If you say, "Oh, I'm sorry," that can be interpreted to mean you're admitting fault to the accident. which
Mm,
then impacts who has to pay for it. So it has these, we're trained not to apologize because it has, financial repercussions. And it was so striking to me because of course that's a natural first thing you want to do. Like you nudge somebody's bumper, the first thing you want to do is be like, I am so sorry. Are you okay? And they're like, you do not under any circumstances apologize or admit fault. And
I I feel like I had to practice doing this because there were times where I apologized and I got beat in my head instead of in feeling like I have to defend myself now instead of apologizing. So, and I feel probably that happened with a lot of people, and that's why it's so hard to apologize.
Yeah. I think also our culture teaches us that it's really important to have power. And the way you have power is by having moral high ground. And the way you have moral high ground is by never being wrong, never admitting you're wrong. When in fact, like so much power comes from not needing a person to feel one way or another about you, right? Which comes from just taking responsibility. But
Yeah.
what we see modeled starting in the US in school, what we see modeled and what we pick up completely, from everything, from every part of socialization is people with power get what they want, people with power are safe, and power over other people is power.
Yeah. Yet we need what I think the question is, and of course, with radical self, if we think of radical self responsibility, we need to apologize, being okay with that apologize not being taken sometimes, and knowing that we don't need the uh, forgiveness from someone else to be free of guilt or shame. We free ourselves from whatever it is. But I feel like the thing with control is that there's so much control model that we forget that even though there might be a relationship of giver and taker in any relationship, we're talking about relationships and not power control. And if we want to have a power control situation, it's a lot different than having a relationship, in my perspective, at least. Like, I feel like I want my relationships to be co creative, like we were talking in the beginning, like as we are together and not like against, like competing for control.
Yeah.
And
Okay,
if we are competing for control, then maybe it's not a relationship. Maybe maybe it's something that needs to be called something else.
this is gonna seem like a non sequitur, but the other day I was in the car and I listened to the radio when I'm in the car, and I just was noticing every single love song from the time I grew up, like the music that I know is about dysfunctional relationship.
Yeah.
And so
Yes.
I said to Grady, I was like, I wonder how we'll see relationships change as music becomes more conscious, right?
Mm,
You're part of this growing movement. And I know Rama is talking a lot about this too, like that there won't be a difference anymore between pop music and spiritual music, right?
yeah.
And they're like, you're already creating this, but these songs that are incredibly uplifting, that are also very catchy tunes that we want to dance to, that are about experiences we recognize, and yet they lift us up. And
Yeah.
or even like with through anger allow us to have catharsis, but always remind us of our higher selves.
Yeah.
And so I'm like, I bet relationships are going to massively change because think about right now, we're completely steeped in dysfunction. All of our music about relationships is about dysfunctional relationship. I can't live without you. I need you, and that's why I hate you. You're mean to me, and that makes me love you more. I mean, it's like, no wonder our concept of relationships is
And our
really
concept of
messed up.
love, like what is really love? Like I used to think love was pretty lame and cheesy based on music.
Yeah, like, the only thing that's interesting is if it's gritty, and I mean,
Yeah,
that's why it brought it up for me, this idea of a power struggle, right? And that's in our media, it's in I mean, when I watch romantic comedies, I'm horrified. I get to the end of a romantic comedy and I'm like, "Oh my goodness, can somebody please hold an intervention? That's codependency." Like, these people should not be together, and please don't let them have children. Um,
oh,
but that we are shown the power struggle as love and as relationship. And I think you've hit on something really important here, that one of the keys, like, these two things are going to serve each other. The more we can be in radical self responsibility, the more we can really have relationships that are about autonomous, freely given um, love and affection. And the more we build those kind of relationships, the more we'll be able to take self responsibility.
yeah, yeah. People should be freely happy together instead of feeling like they're binded to each other. Like you, you have no other option than being miserable together.
Well, my favorite extreme example is like Agatha Christie mysteries, where often it's the spouse poisoning, the spouses kill one another. And I'm like, think about that. They got to a place where they're like, I don't want to be with you anymore. So the only solution is for you to cease to exist. Like, did it get to a point where you could just be like, oh, actually, I'm out of here? Did you consider just leaving the marriage? But no, it's like we're so locked into this struggle and this battle of wills that we think the only way for me to win in the relationship is for you to die. Like,
Yeah,
that's an amazing snapshot of our sense of lack of responsibility in relationships, projecting it onto the other person and demanding that somebody else be responsible for our happiness.
yeah.
Um, so what's coming up as an insight for you?
Mm. There are many, as we were talking, and every time I get to the end, I forget what was the biggest one. But well, this is probably not the biggest one. But when you mentioned the conflict bringing energy in there, about the ADHD and so on, I was thinking part of part of the lack of responsibility is also uh, the difficulty that people have to get into productive conflict and actually just pushing things aside, because we mentioned a lot, like all the things that we push aside, the shame, the guilt, and so on. uh, what if productive um, conflict and productive, like looking into whatever is that it's not perfect but we're just pushing aside, and it can be in internal conflict, it can be with other people as well, because sometimes it's an internal conflict that we're just pushing aside. It's okay, leave it there, I don't want to mess with it. What are the things that we can take responsibility that might get us more into harmony to be able to create? Because that conflict, either internal or external, that we think it's a bad thing, if that brings energy, maybe that's that pocket of energy that we need to get things moving.
I love that. That does feel like a skill I'm lacking, I think I don't observe it a lot in other people too, is productive conflict. Although I can think of somebody I know who always impresses me with her ability to, like, speak up in a kind way, like, if something's happening to just say, like, "But wait a minute, why would that be more effective?" Or, like, "But wait a minute, it sounds like" to speak to something that she disagrees with
Yeah.
and speak to the issue. Whereas I think most of the time oh my gosh, I was just noticing this, how immediately I jump to an ad hominem about the person. Like, oh, you, something that's a specific identifier about them where I'm like, that's what's wrong with you. No, what's wrong with you is that we disagree on this thing and it's causing friction. But I jump immediately to like, that's just because you're a terrible, mean person.
I can totally relate. I can totally relate. And sometimes it's because we don't want to have the conversation that needs to be had. And
Right, but I love this point of view that you're getting a surge of energy in order to be able to do that hard thing.
yeah.
Ooh, that. Okay. Yes. I love it. That's gonna be my insight too.
Love it.
Nice.
Beautiful.
Well, let us know what your insight is, everybody listening. And
Yeah.
yeah, what do you want to do with it? I would love to find myself asking more often of other people, do you think there's something I could do next time for a better outcome?
Yeah. That's a great one. And even like the apologizing first, even if you don't feel like you were the one that did wrong, what is my part of responsibility in
Yeah.
this?
Yeah. Cause I feel like that's just deciding to release the desire for conflict and deciding to release the tension and taking a step toward a person as opposed to a step away. Like, oh, that's just them because, they're terrible.
And I think there's one thing to clarify here. When we talk about apologize first, it's not about taking all the responsibility and like guilting yourself, like I'm sorry, I've done something terrible.
Or
No,
I'm a terrible mother. Yeah.
terrible more. No,
Yeah.
it's being very logical and specific with what were your part of the responsibility and what you wish you had done differently that would be better, even clarifying that, and not about trying to explain, I've done this but you've done this to me, or I've done this because I was this and this and this.
Yeah.
Eh, yeah, it, responsibility is not about finding a reason to like, oh, but
Yeah.
it it's just, I'm sorry, I should have done this better.
It makes
How?
me think of people playing cards and gambling and betting, and they're like escalating, right? Okay, you bet this, so now I'm gonna bet this, and you bet this. But the person who just lays their cards down ends the escalation, right?
Yeah,
So you just like go like, oh wait, this is my hand. That's
yeah.
it.
And it's also about showing that we care more about the other person than about being right.
Yes, and about the relationship specifically, I would say, yeah, I care more about having this relationship with you and being able to connect with you than I do about being right about this thing.
Yeah.
Mm, boy, that makes me want to do some writing because that was a big part of my journey, like holding ideas and ideology more important than people. That was a big part of my journey for a long time. Mm.
Yeah. Mm,
Mm.
I love it.
Yay. I'm inspired. Thank you.
Thank you. I always love our conversations.
Yeah.
So, thank you everyone who watches this. If you have any insights, leave them in the comments. And until the next Incite Club. Take care.
Take care.